Christos Voskres, Christ is risen.
Indeed, he is risen.
So today we gather from coast to coast to coast in celebration and in unity of life, the sacredness of life, for our annual March for Life, upholding the sanctity of life, a sacred duty of each and every one of us. Allow me to share a few words with you from the perspective on the sanctity of life, from yesterday's perspective, today's perspective, and tomorrow's perspective. Well, in the United States in January of 1973, the Supreme Court invalidated 50 state laws and made abortion legal on demand throughout the United States in the decisions of Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton. Already 1 year later, in January of 1974, the first March for Life walks on Washington to lobby congressional leadership to find a legislative solution to the Supreme Court's decision. Soon after realizing congressional protection of the unborn was not on the horizon, a March for Life every year until Roe versus Wade is overturned began to take place. Canada was even earlier. The National March for Life, and our nation's capital, typically the largest gathering and protest annually on Parliament Hill, which takes place in May, marks the passing of the 1969 omnibus bill, which decriminalized abortion. And since then, pro-lifers rally in front of our Parliament building and walk throughout downtown Ottawa, demanding that our political representatives fight for the right to life of every human being. And so then over the years, not only in Ottawa, but throughout Canada, in towns and cities, small and large, March for Life has brought together over the years hundreds of thousands of Canadians of all ages. Yesterday's perspective. The sanctity of life, today's perspective. March for Life has necessarily grown over the years in regards to its prayerful intent and desire. The protection of the unborn is still first and foremost on the minds and hearts of the organizers and participants. At the same time, March for Life seeks to transform the hearts of all, including our elected officials, to enact laws that protect life from conception unto natural death. From conception to natural death. Today, another storm is on the horizon, indeed is already here, medical assistance in dying. The passage of Bill C-7 into law on March 7th of this year by the Government of Canada greatly expands the eligibility criteria within Canada's MAID legislation, allowing euthanasia and assisted suicide for those whose death is not reasonably foreseeable. In our recent message from the Catholic bishops in Canada on this matter, we write, the possible pressures that will be placed on persons with mental illnesses or disabilities resulting from the most recent legislative changes are all too real, perilous, and potentially destructive. Our position remains unequivocal. Euthanasia and assisted suicide constitute the deliberate killing of human life in violation of God's commandments. They erode our shared dignity by failing to see, to accept, and to accompany those suffering and dying. Furthermore, they undermine the fundamental duty we have to take care of the weakest and most vulnerable members of society. Human life must be protected from conception to natural death at all stages and in all conditions. The sanctity of life, tomorrow's perspective. Pope Francis, our Holy Father, upholds the sanctity of life from conception to natural death and everything in between. He writes, how sad it is that there is a large outcry when the stock markets drop 100 points. And yet there is silence on the streets when a man dies alone in the streets, in the gutter. Pope Francis offers, during this time of pandemic and following, hope. He sees a better path to a future. And in his book, Let Us Dream, The Path to a Better Future, he sees hope coming out of the crisis of the pandemic. The Holy Father writes on the sanctity of life for tomorrow. Tomorrow we must redesign the economy so that it can offer every person access to a dignified existence while protecting and regenerating the natural world. For tomorrow, what is the greatest fruit of a personal crisis? I'd say, he says, sprinkled with a healthy sense of humor, which allows us to endure and make space for change to happen. When I speak of change, I mean that those people who are now on the edges become the means of changing society today. We do not possess the truth so much as the truth possesses us, constantly attracting us by means of beauty and goodness. The Holy Father continues, sin is a rejection of the limits that love requires. And the Holy Father concludes, our greatest power is not in the respect that we have, that others have for us, but the service that we can offer others. Perhaps I've led you a little bit astray up until now, intentionally albeit, in reflecting on the sanctity of life under the context of yesterday, today, and tomorrow's perspectives. I've intentionally left out another perspective, and in reality, the only one that counts, God's perspective. God's perspective reminds us today of the story of creation and the original meaning of the sanctity of life. As we read in the book of Genesis, God created humankind in God's image. In the image of God, He created them, male and female, He created them. Created in the image and likeness of God, our vocation then, our calling, is to become like God, to grow in holiness, to accept God's invitation and original plan to grow in loving communion with God and with one another. Let us not reject God's plan to be holy, to respect the sanctity of life that God's self, the author and the very giver of life, bestows upon us. Adam and Eve of old did just that, and it didn't turn out all too well for them. They were tempted by a false holiness, a false divinization, suggesting the thought of becoming God, but without God, by means of one's own efforts and merits. Rather, let us accept God's plan for us, God's love, God's mercy, and let us acknowledge anew, respect, support, and defend the sanctity of life from conception to its natural death. Indeed, the message of Easter, the message of the resurrection, is the message of hope. Jesus comes into the world as one of us to tell us of God's love and to invite us to follow Him. In Jesus' death and resurrection, He offers us the hope of a new life, eternal life, in communion with God, as God had intended from the very beginning when He created us. In conclusion, a word of gratitude and thanks. We truly wish to acknowledge and support all those individuals and communities who continue to support and defend the sanctity of life in person and in action. Let us renew our involvement wherever we live, and to partner with members of our parish or other faith groups and organizations to continue lobbying our elected officials about these matters. Above all, as the Catholic bishops in Canada write, we need to pray earnestly for a new outpouring of grace, so that the fear and despair experienced by many will give way to courage and hope, and that all may welcome the call to support the sanctity of life in ways that reflect the loving and compassionate gaze of Jesus, the risen Lord who lives forever. Finally, we recall the words of the Gospel of Matthew in the Great Commissioning, when Jesus commands the disciples and you and me today to go forth, to baptize and to teach, but be assured that I am with you always. May God bless us. May God bless the sanctity of life. Christos voskres.
Christ
Christ is
is risen. Indeed, he is risen.